prophet Jeremiah reminds us that nothing is too hard for God. That's definitely true, as we will show for Holy Cross Faith Memorial, and the people we will be showing slides of and talking about today, who persisted and endured, sometimes with the help of the diocese, sometimes despite the diocese, sometimes with the help of the churches, sometimes despite the churches, but they did endure. And the manuscript I'm working on is called The Enduring Faith of a Believing People. I call upon my brother and my friend, Canon McCall, to pray us into these sessions.
Thank you, Jack. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious Spirit, prepare our listening ears, hearts, and minds at this time as you allow us to hear this history that's been long overdue for us to hear and to absorb. Help all of what we've learned today, help us move towards the steps of reconciliation in our life, to celebrate the amazing figures of color who've made such a great impact in our diocese and in our lives. Help each of us to find ways of discernment throughout this work, how we can absorb this history and take it upon us to be empowered to do something about it. We're grateful for our historians today who have put in years to find this work. We're grateful for our bishop to really lead this gracious leadership of racial justice and reconciliation for our diocese. We thank everyone here in the Diocese of South Carolina, where we have a heart and passion to do this gracious work. Lead and guide us along the way as we begin a very important pilgrimage of understanding the history of race and how we can reconcile. So in Christ's gracious name we say, Amen. And I will turn it over to Bishop Ruth Woodliff Stanley.
Well, good morning. Thank you for braving, maybe not hell, but high water to get here. What a fabulous, fabulous crowd. Thank you to our friends of Holy Cross Faith Memorial, as always, for your wonderful hospitality in doing essential work in this diocese. And thank you to our esteemed scholars who will soon be sharing their knowledge and wisdom with us. I also want to offer a word of gratitude to our Racial Justice Commission, who have been working on such a thoughtful arc of work for us in our diocese. If you are part of our Racial Justice Commission, could you stand as you're able or raise your hand if you prefer that to standing to be recognized? Please recognize these folks. I want to just offer a couple of words to you about my coming into this diocese and this work and before I do that, let me take a moment of personal privilege, because I haven't gotten to tell all of you this. I'm looking around this room and I see people who have sent me cards, flowers, food, prayers. I know some of you have been telling me you've been praying for me daily. I'm on the mend, and I want to say thank you for your love and care for me. I have really appreciated it. I've really needed those prayers. It has deepened my understanding of what it means that we are really in beloved community together. And it's not easy for this bishop of yours to be on the receiving end sometimes. I think that's true for a lot of us, but boy, have I been blessed by it. So thank you. I want to say a few words about what I heard as I was coming in, not as your bishop, but as one discerning with other candidates, as a bishop candidate. From the earliest conversations, as I listened to try to hear what is the hunger, what is the need from the first time that I read the profile to the listening with the search committee into the candidate conversations, right? If I could boil it down, a bit of oversimplifying, I know, but I heard really three things. I heard a commitment to and hunger to further the work of justice, specifically race justice work and LGBTQ plus justice work. And I heard a desire for healing in the midst of toward the end of a long, difficult, recent struggle. And I heard an appetite to build the church in a new season. Those are the three things. And as I listened to that more deeply, it became very clear to me that in fact is the sequence of these things. In other words, namely, if we want to be able to build a church for a new season, we have to really begin with an understanding of the justice work. Even to do healing, we have to understand that, right? If we didn't learn anything else from Archbishop Tutu, we learned that, right? You don't do healing work unless it's built on a foundation of justice and truth. And then the next piece follows, some healing work, and then the capacity to build. So some of you know we've been through a little thing called a schism. I say that playfully, it's not little, I know. But what many of you made very clear to me as I listened is that story, which is a painful and hard story in this diocese, sits inside of a much larger story that bears the same marks. And we're going to hear about that story today, right? So the story of the recent disenfranchisement of many people sitting in this room sits inside of a story that is centuries in the making of disenfranchisement of people. And that is the story with which we must reckon in order to understand how to move forward with healing on a firm foundation in this diocese. The Racial Justice Commission has really appreciated that. And as we have been in the arc of work over the last 3 years, we have begun to do some really meaningful things around getting us all to the same place and our understanding of the story of race in this country. And we recognize together as a group that understanding the story of race in this diocese, in this state, is an essential piece of the work. And so I am so thrilled that this group has convened this work. As I'm going to offer just a brief introduction to someone I think most of you already know, who is our canon, who is convening this work, Canon Ramel McCall. One of the things that some of you said to me on those Zoom calls and those candid conversations, in fact, one person in this room asked me very pointedly, are you going to call an African-American leader into core leadership at a diocesan level? And then I heard that echoed in some of the other rooms. And that was a really clear moment for me of understanding how important it is to have icons for us as a diocese. And so I really sat with that and said, wow, there's some wisdom there, and began to pray and listen and look. And I began to hear from other folks, including some bishops, about this wonderful young leader who is steeped in a background of community organizing. And I started hearing like, oh, there's a race on about who is going to be calling this person into that leadership. So I am so thrilled and so delighted that we in this diocese were able to call Canon Ramel McCall from the land of crabs in Maryland to come here and be about that work that he loves dearly of community organizing and convening us. And I want to thank you, Canon McCall, for the work you're doing. and invite you to come forward now and get us to the next step. And I welcome conversation with you all about what you're hearing and how you think it impacts you at a local level, and how I and all of us who exist to serve and support and expand your work in the bishop's office can further the work that you need to do that comes out of this day. So with that, Ramel.
Thank you, Bishop, and thank you, Diocese of South Carolina. So you might have heard my name already. I'm Reverend Ramel McCall, your candidate for leadership on bishop's staff of this gracious diocese. And I oversee many tiers. And so one of those, obviously, is racial justice and reconciliation work for our diocese. And as a Black person, I feel committed to this work because my history has not always been well publicized. It's not always been readily available, and or taught, or just all that. It's been suppressed for many years. It's been suppressed. And so during my time serving in the Diocese of Maryland, I witnessed an entire group of Episcopalians begin to discern and share their truth about race in the diocese. And so they acknowledged that some churches were built by slaves. It was important for that diocese to acknowledge that. They acknowledged that some churches had slaves buried in their property. They had to acknowledge that. The diocese itself had to acknowledge that they were benefactors of slave labor. So they had to put that in writing and acknowledge that. And so this truth-telling, this acknowledgement, eventually allowed that diocese to begin to do what I call some racial healing, so racial reckoning through prayer, creating assets that would help particularly our marginalized communities in that area of the diocese, and find other ways to eradicate racism. So, and they're still doing that work, but I was there to witness how everyone collectively began to put those efforts together. Now, as your canon, I have the pleasure of visiting different churches. You see me pop there all the time. And one of the things I'm so grateful for in this amazing call as your canon is you trust me enough to hear some of those stories of some Black figure who've made an impact in this area. Says, Reverend, I need to tell you about this person. I need to share this person with you. And so for my almost 2 years of being here, I remember those stories and how much of an impact is made even in your worship space. Here's the thing. However, all of us don't collectively know those pieces. I think it would be selfish for me to just hold all that together. But it came to me and says, I think we all need to be hearing the same conversation. We need to broaden this conversation so all of us can hear that together. And so that's why it's important for all of us here today. And I'm so grateful. Thank you for making the trip through the rain to just hear and to absorb this together as we move forward to continue the work of reconciliation. So I'm going to stop talking, and it gives me great pleasure to now introduce the Reverend Dr. Adam Shoemaker, Rector of St. Stephen's Charleston and co-chair of the Racial Justice Reconciliation, who will explain more about the value of this important work. Adam?
Good morning, everybody. It is heartening to see this crowd, given the weather. I am Adam Shoemaker, Rector of St. Stephen's, and since the founding of our Diocesan Racial Justice and Reconciliation Commission, it's been my privilege to serve as co-chair alongside Ms. Gail DaCosta of Grace Church Cathedral. Thank you so very much, Gail, for all of your wonderful work. It's been a joy to serve alongside you. Several years ago now, we set about our work, and after Bishop Ruth arrived, we talked as a commission about identifying areas for our work, and we ultimately settled upon the areas of education, training, and advocacy. But over time, as we reached out to other dioceses doing this work, we came to realize as Canon McCall and Bishop Ruth have both noted, that we can't effectively advocate for racial justice and equity in our diocese in the present and the future if we don't collectively appreciate our past, our history, where we've come from. We've got to know where we've come from to know more accurately where we are going. And so we created a subcommittee to be focused on history. And it's been my privilege to chair that subcommittee over the past year. That subcommittee is made up in part by commission members and in part by others from around our diocese. If you are a part of our history subcommittee, would you please stand and be recognized? The subcommittee spent some time beginning to research the history of our diocese. We still have a lot more work to do, but we came to the opinion that we need to begin to already share what we've been learning. And that's where this Learning Day comes in. And it is our hope that this Learning Day can be the first of many, so that we as a diocese can better appreciate together where we have come from. And I'm so very grateful to Holy Cross Faith Memorial for hosting today this first conversation that will focus heavily on the African American history of this particular part of our diocese. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Mr. George McDaniel from our History Subcommittee, who will lead us into our first block of time. George.
Good morning. I got a big voice. So first of all, I just want to say thank you to Holy Cross Faith Memorial for having us here. It just warms my heart to look out and see all of these chairs filled, and particularly given the less than ideal weather. And thank you to Canon McCall and all of those on the Racial Justice and Racial Reconciliation Subcommittee. Just a brief intro as to why am I up here? So I'm a professional historian. I'm a historian for South Carolina Battleground Preservation Trust. But I did my undergrad in African American history at Davidson College, and then spent 10 years as a professional guitar player, slinging my guitar across the Southeast. Before I returned to graduate school at the University of Mississippi's Center for the Study of Southern Culture. And while there, I managed two museums. One was the first African-American church established in Oxford following the Civil War that had been turned into an African-American history museum. And the other was the Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus, say that 5 times fast, Lamar House, which was a postbellum house that the LQC Lamar, who was a 19th century Mississippi statesman and also a slavery apologist, as it goes. And so I did a lot of time trying to reconcile and get those two in conversation, because you can't tell the story of one without the other, right? And so before I begin, my talk is Towards Freedom, South Carolina and its Difficult History. And so as a professional historian, one of the things that I think is incredibly important is understanding context, right? That's the key of history is getting context. So others this morning and this afternoon are going to speak on specific bits, but I volunteered myself to give you a bit of South Carolina history, really from 1670 into the modern day. So a fun task, to be sure. But in thinking about that, as I said, the title is Towards Freedom. Notice it's not freedom, because towards is aspirational, right? That we're still moving towards this goal. And as you'll see as we move through in this talk, that is a continuous sort of theme of moving towards this goal of freedom. With that, I want to ask a question. Who here knows what the word history comes from, what its etymology is? Anyone? I got some clergy. I know y'all took Greek, right? So it comes from the Greek historia, meaning to inquire. It's asking questions, right? And so it's not, as it so often is taught, as memorizing dates, places, people, and that's a part of it, to be sure, but that's not what it is at its essence. And so what I hope to do is to, as we move through this, vast expanse of South Carolina history, get you to think about these things as we move through the day and ask questions, because that's such a key. So I'm gonna move over here so I'm not standing right in front of the screen. So, towards freedom. So, this is a map of South Carolina from 1773. And what I want you to take notice of, and this will make sense here as we go through, notice what is marked all across these vast rivers. And of course, this big mark through here, this is the Santee. Which is just down there. If you drove up from Charleston, or those of y'all here in Pawleys Island and such know, that feeds out right near Georgetown. But just think about, these rivers are going to play an important part as we move through and thinking about freedom. So we're going to begin. John Locke, the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, because it was not South Carolina at that point. They're adopted by the 8 Lords Proprietors on March 1st, 1669. One of the keys, and this is this idea of religious freedom. Part of the fundamental constitutions, Jews, heathens, and other dissenters, and so that means non-Anglicans, right? So the British Church, the Church of England, settling the colony. So dissenters were those who were not of those, but still Protestant, all Protestant. So we have Huguenots and Jewish Anabaptists, Quakers, all this vast, various Christian Protestant denominations. But of course, the Catholics, you've got French and France and Spain bordering nearby, and so they did not want Catholics. But in relative terms, this is a fairly liberal policy to allow these various religious groups to come to Carolina. So in thinking about that, here is a map of Charlestown becomes Charleston following the Revolutionary War. But Charlestown, this is what's called the Old World City, and we can see here some of these, the various churches. You have an Anabaptist, a Presbyterian, the Quaker Meeting House is outside these walls. But just to show sort of this diversity of religions as we move through. So 18th century Charlestown was very different. When most people think of, South Carolina, Charleston history, a lot of what's thought of is this 19th century antebellum, and some, of course, Gone with the Wind cosplay type deal. Well, 18th century Charleston was an entirely different world. It was it was a major port in the much larger Atlantic world, which would have been, the Barbados and the West Indies, all of Europe, and this huge world that was feeding into this city. So Charlestown was what we call polyglot. Anyone want to take a guess at what polyglot means?
Multiple languages.
Boom, very good. Poly, of course, polygon, and so meaning many, and glot meaning tongue, so many tongues. So Charleston, you would have heard French, Spanish, Portuguese, and that's not German, and that's not even to mention all of the African languages that were being brought by those enslaved who were being brought from Africa into Charlestown. Again, these waterways and this port is so critical. But as you'll notice, down here, you can see that's Charleston. Well, these little rivers just run very short distances, just about 30 miles inland. As opposed to up in the mid-Atlantic. This is Virginia, New Jersey, New York. So you see the Potomac, the James, the Rappahannock, all the Hudson. And these rivers flow deep inland and some even into the Great Lakes. And so you have this development of cities and such much further inland than you do in South Carolina, which is why map of the Anglican parishes in South Carolina. Notice where they are, all down right around the coast. So that's why the Diocese of South Carolina is sort of where it is, and it developed where it did. It's because the rivers only went so far inland. And the Santee, as I pointed out, it runs deep. It's navigable very deep into the interior, but at its mouth, it's fairly shallow, and so it wasn't a natural port like Charlestown was. Here is de Brahm's map showing the parishes, just again highlighting how sort of coastal centric South Carolina was in its development. So, Samuel Seabury. So he is the first American Episcopal bishop, and he was consecrated by Scottish bishops. Everyone know why he was consecrated by Scottish bishops?
You could not be consecrated in England without pledging allegiance to the king.
Right. Could not be consecrated in England without pledging allegiance to the king. And of course, we had just fought a war. So England was not too pleased with us to begin with. And so, I put one thing down and move it around. So we had just fought this war, so he went to England. They would not consecrate him, but the Scottish bishops would. And so he's the first American Episcopal bishop. And so, again, sort of this, thinking about this freedom, the Episcopal Church is a child of the Revolution, and sort of comes out of this. But of course, when I say that, it is freedom for whom, right? And so we're going to talk about slavery, of course, and talk about, there's going to be some difficult images, but this is part of that talk, and it's important to see this, to acknowledge it. One, just to acknowledge the horrors of it, but also to acknowledge the resilience that these people who were enslaved had. Okay, so to begin, Sullivan's Island. This is where many enslaved were brought and then were quarantined on Sullivan's Island, which is just north of Charleston in the harbor. And this is an advertisement for enslaved people being brought and to be sold. So, Charlestown is founded in 1670. In 1683, so a very short time after, the first runaway act to prevent runaways is established. So just a very short time. What that shows us is that already those that are being brought over are seeking freedom, despite the hardships that they have endured in the Middle Passage, and then also are enduring once they arrive in the port. And it is interesting, the coast, coastal Carolina, the Low Country, bears a fairly striking resemblance to that environment that they would have been familiar with in West Africa and that sort of thing. So that some of them ran away right as they got off the boat. But that idea of seeking freedom in Carolina. So this is just a staggering statistic. Between 1670 and 1808, nearly 200,000 enslaved people were brought. Half of the bondspeople who disembarked came through the port of Charlestown. The rivers, again, keep showing this, and I promise you it's going somewhere. We're going to get to it. But these rivers, again, these are kind of these pathways to freedom or of freedom for the enslaved in South Carolina. When we think about runaway slaves, we often think about, following the North Star, escaping all the way to the, into freedom. Harriet Tubman, of course, in Maryland, but she was operating on largely on the eastern shore of Maryland, so a very small distance. To get from South Carolina all the way up to freed states over land was incredibly treacherous, because you have slave patrols that are numerous and all of these various dangerous factors. And so Edward Baptist, in his fantastic book, which is on the bibliography that I created for today, The Half Has Never Been Told, the number of enslaved migrants from the depths during slavery numbered under 1,000. And when you think of, that's 1/10 of 1%, that would have made it all the way from South Carolina there. But that does not mean, and if you were caught, the fate that would wait for you was this place called the Sugar House. And the Sugar House was located, is right next to the Old City Jail, or was right next to the Old City Jail in Charleston. But it was a prison and torture site for enslaved people. And it would have been in the minds of all, even if they were not, did not run away or were not caught, it would have been in the consciousness of those enslaved. And oftentimes we forget when we say, slavery, enslaved, just the sheer, just numbers that they were. It's tough to imagine that they were truly treated like just livestock. This is from up near St. George, South Carolina, in Dorchester County. And what's happening here is someone has died, and their enslaved are being broken up and sold off to people in the area. And the way that they did it was just give a monetary value to the enslaved person and then break those up into almost equal units. So we have about 3,075, 3,200, 2,950. So they've just been broken up. Disregard family units, anything of that. It's purely just a livestock, which I think is tough to wrap your head around. But this is what it is. They were just broken up in monetary values and then sold off to, as they said, as David Gavin, who was his diary, he was a planter up in that area. All were pleased with the lots that they drew, which of course he means the white planters and not the enslaved people. Harriet Tubman, this again is what we think about often when we think about runaways and escaping. And this is just a painting that was done in 2005 of her. But this is sort of like I think the image that a lot of people have. But in South Carolina, it was very different. This is from Morgan's Slave Counterpoint. For the past 6 months, Nero and his female companions have been seen at James Island, Sullivan's Island, St. James, Goose Creek, and Charleston. So they're moving all around the what we call today the Tri-County area, the Charleston area. And how are they doing that? Well, they would have been, again, using those waterways as sort of a localized underground railroad, this network that they had, and using the swamps and then these connecting waterways as a local underground railroad to travel, one, to seek freedom just from the owner, the enslaver. But they also would have had families as we saw with that divvying up, that might be elsewhere. So there are accounts of them going to visit a wife and children on other plantations. And so they're moving around. It's this seeking of freedom again. This is Reverend William Barnwell, and a letter to a friend. He was an Episcopal priest. This was written in 1832. The hearts of masters are turned in a wonderful degree to their slaves, and we are in the neighborhood striving to give them that freedom which alone can make them happy. Freedom from sin and hell by the blood of a crucified Savior. God bless the work. And so, just this, we have this idea of freedom, and that his notion is that they are giving these enslaved people freedom through the blessings of Christ. I think if you were to ask some of those who he had evangelized to, they might say, I'll take my freedom here in this life, but just a hunch. So, this is a runaway ad from Charleston Courier in 1853. They will likely spend time in the Colleton district and perhaps pass down on rafts. This would be along the Edisto Four-Hole Swamp and the Edisto River, down to Charleston, and very likely have guns to shoot ducks and carry to sell them in the city. And so this is these men, Jim and Horace, or Jim and Harris, are seeking freedom in these rivers, and we see that they have some agency. They're shooting ducks and then selling them down in Charleston. They have agency in doing so, but they are risking a great deal. And what they are risking if they are caught is the sugar house. This is James Matthews. I've heard a great deal said about hell and wicked places, but I don't think there is any worse hell than that sugar house. It's as bad as a place can be. And this is it following the earthquake of 1886. This is a photograph from the National Geological team that was sent down here, and it was damaged. You can see the crack right here, and it was damaged and then had to be was torn down. But he continues, you may hear the whip and paddle all hours in the day. There's no stopping. As soon as one is loosed from the rope, another is ready to be put in. Some days they have so many brought to be punished that they don't get through till late at night. This is the treadmill that would have been one of the torture devices that would have been used in the sugar house. And as you can see, the description, you can read the description, so their hands were bound up here to this bar, and then this treadmill looked like a paddle wheel on the paddle wheel ships in the Mississippi River. But their feet would have had to keep up with it, and if they did not keep up, they were lashed. But I want you to notice, look who's doing the lashing. So there's this complicated idea of freedom even within the sugar house, that this gentleman is enslaved and is probably a prisoner at the sugar house and has been instructed to lash his fellow enslaved men and women on the treadmill, and certainly would have been told that if he did not do so, he could then join them on the treadmill and someone else would step in and do it. And so there's this very complicated dynamic that's going on. And I say this, this is, again, acknowledging these horrors is so vitally important. And the reason I think it's so vitally important is because you have to be honest with what happened in order to then be honest about where we can go. But it also, I think, speaks to the resilience that these men and women had, that they knew that this fate might befall them if they ran away or if they did something that would get them in trouble and showing some sort of agency and freedom. But they still did it because it was so important to them that was crucial. And so even knowing the horrors of this, that they still did it, I think speaks just volumes. And it's important to recognize because it's not about laying guilt and those things, but it's more about lifting these peoples up and their spirit of resilience and their striving for freedom that's crucial. Sugar House. So freedom. Let me just check my time. Okay. Ed Ayers came to the University of Mississippi when I was there, and he had one of the greatest lines I've ever heard about Reconstruction. I'm going to teach you about I'm going to talk about Reconstruction. You know that period of history that's taught between Christmas and New Year's. It's fantastic. He's one of the deans of sort of 19th century history and was president of University of Richmond. This is, of course, General Order Number 3. That is the Juneteenth, signed June 19th, that established freedom. And on February 21st, this is a drawing of the 55th Massachusetts Colored Regiment marching in the streets of Charleston and singing John Brown's March as freedom had come. Fort Sumter, which of course was where the Confederates fired the first shots. On April 14th, 1865, thousands gathered at Fort Sumter to raise the American flag and celebrate the end of the Civil War and freedom coming to those who had been enslaved. One of the first things that they did when freedom came was they got married. This is from Mississippi, because I just had this in my work, but this is from in Oxford, Mississippi, but it's a marriage license, and marriage licenses just explode all of a sudden because they wanted to get married. And in Eric Foner's tome and seminal work, Reconstruction, second only to the family as a focal point of black life stood the church. The creation of an independent black religious life proved to be a momentous and irreversible consequence of emancipation. Again, freedom of religion and establishing your own churches and things. So this is a church established during Reconstruction on Wadmalaw Island, which is just outside of Charleston. Zion School, which was established in Charleston. So get married, establish a church, and then have education for the next generation. One thing we forget is that during South Carolina, following the Civil War, had a massive amount of African-American political leaders. 76 of the 124 delegates at the 1868 South Carolina Constitutional Convention were African-American. They understood the power that was in politics and the power of the franchise, and worked hard to gather that, to gain that freedom. But with that, of course, comes the violent backlash. Has anyone seen this movie, Birth of a Nation? It is incredibly painful to watch, but it also, it's one of these things that it's incredibly painful. Just to tell you how painful it is if you haven't seen it, the KKK are the heroes of the movie. But it is also one of the crowning achievements in cinematic history. It's D.W. Griffith, when he did this in early 1930s. It was the first long-form film that had been done. Prior to that, it had been just short films, and this was the first one that actually reached long form. But again, KKK are your heroes in the movie. So, quickly thinking about moving forward, the telling of history and that asking of questions. Silencing the Past, a fantastic book on the creation of history. It has the 4 moments that silence enters. The moment of fact creation, so when it's recorded, so who's writing the diary, who's doing the recording. The moment of assembly, that's the archives when it's collected. The moment of retrieval, that's the making of narratives. And then the moment of retrospective, when we're thinking about what are we going to teach and what are we going to do. So, speaking of that, who grew up with this textbook in South Carolina? Okay, so this is Mary C. Sims Oliphant. That was her history book that she wrote published in 1913. Her grandfather had, William Gilmore Sims, had written a history of South Carolina in 1860. He was a slavery apologist, And she took his work, took Granddad's work from 1860, updated it with a little bit about Reconstruction, kind of a D.W. Griffith updating of the telling of Reconstruction, and published that in 1913. That book was the history textbook with updated editions from 1913 until the late 1980s. That was the textbook. So that's when, people say that, oh, that's not the history I learned in school. Well, guess who wrote your textbook, So that just shows but she understood the power of creating the history and writing the history. That the United Daughters of the Confederacy, they understood that the way to maintain their power, their grasp, white supremacy and white power, was through education and through writing these textbooks and educating generations to come. And it was, for 70 years, that was the textbook in South Carolina on history. Jim Crow. This just astonishes me, because we've seen all the bathrooms and the water fountains, but black beaches in 1960s. So even where you went to go swimming in the ocean was segregated. But Martin Luther, the 1960s, we get the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King comes to Mother Emanuel Church, and Mother Emanuel AME Church in 1962. Of course, we have Coretta King, Rosa Parks, and Septima Clark, Septima Clark, of course, the major figure in Charleston civil rights and civil rights, and King called her the mother. But language, right, is important. And we're getting into today. And this is where things are really going to start to tie together. So this is from the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission. If you haven't heard of the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, imagine if Jim Crow, Mississippi in the 1950s had their own private white supremacist FBI, right? And so this was, whereas all across the South you had citizens' councils and those things, this was even more insidious than that. It was a private FBI for the Mississippi government. This is a report from one of their agents, and he's been to a town in Mississippi, and he says, he's talking about what he told the county sheriff and others. They have been instructed not to refer to anyone as a N-word or a Negro, but simply refer to them as communist or subversive individuals. Does that sound familiar? Do we hear echoes of that today, right? So, Black Lives Matter. This is obviously in Washington, D.C. Here is some photographs I took at a march in front of Mother Emanuel Church, but uproot systemic racism, etc. And then here's the Moms for Liberty. Ban CRT and DEI. I'm sure someone, not in this crowd, but there's probably something about, communists and, the Red Scare. The same tactics, right? The same ideas of what Mary Sims Oliphant did in 1913 with her book. That's, again, the lessons have been learned. They know them. They know what they're doing. And so this movement doesn't just spring out of nowhere. It has its own long history. So that's why it's so important that we have things like this today, where we talk about these things and acknowledge the painful truths and the painful past and the horrors that were slavery. When I was doing, in graduate school, interpretation with this Behind the Big House program in Holly Springs, we would get the question of, well, weren't there good masters or, it's beside the point. The institution of slavery was horrid. And whether or not, yes, there might have been somebody who was kinder, more benevolent, but the institution of slavery itself, always over it, hung, like the sword of Damocles, hung the places like the Sugar House and that possibility. So the relevance of whether someone was kind or good. That's not a right question. And so it's about the institution itself. So finally, back to these rivers that they use as sort of, we see them now as sort of these pathways to freedom. And they're such an important part of South Carolina history and speak. So I'm going to conclude with Langston Hughes reading a poem called The Negro Dreams of Rivers that he wrote when he was 18 years old. Right after he had graduated from high school, he took a trip down the Mississippi, and at 18 wrote this poem, and I will conclude with that and then come back and finish. But this is only about 50 seconds or so. If it'll play. Okay. Oh, we don't have sound. That's okay. He talks about the rivers and seeking freedom, and knowing the rivers, and that his soul has grown deep like the river. And so it's a wonderful poem, Langston Hughes. So I will conclude, and it is now my wonderful honor to introduce Jack Roper of Holy Cross Faith Memorial, who is going to share some of his amazing work that he's done here and talk specifically about Holy Cross and the amazing things and people that he has found who did this.
Just before you come up, Jack, if I may take a moment of personal privilege to just call an audible for a moment of prayer, as we have seen images that are extremely violent and injurious to the soul, and particularly to those of African descent in this room. I just want to invite us, before we move to the next section, to have a moment of silence in memory and in respect. Amen.
Come right on, Jack. I certainly will.
I too will talk about rivers. Can y'all hear me okay? In the back table there, my friend Bess has books, and she has a bookstore, and it's not Amazon, it's a bookstore. And I had given her George's very fine bibliography, and she can help you get those books. I've also given her a handout, about a 2-page handout, where my advisor, Joel Williamson, wrote Positive Achievements of Reconstruction. And also his book, After Slavery, is there. And he taught with great distinction, and I inherited his class since I went to Carolina, too. There's useful information there. For today, though, now that we've heard the grand overview, I'm going to be talking much more locally. And in fact, most of the time I'm going to be talking about one family, just one family, through 6 generations of slavery and Jim Crow, who created this church where we go. We have a map here showing rivers. You know about the importance of rivers. You are not in Pawleys Island. The post office is not in Pawleys Island. Pawleys Island is an incorporated place where about 300 triply blessed souls live. I go often as an outsider coming in and looking at it, and it's beautiful. We are midway Waccamaw Neck. We got places for a long, long time from Georgetown to Conway Borough on the Waccamaw River, running about 22 miles. And it was part of the Intracoastal Waterway. And on that Waccamaw River, there is a marker showing the midway point. And there's a plantation there, and this John C. Calhoun helped get the Intracoastal Waterways built because he wanted to have federal government involved heavily in transportation and in building a big government. And Calhoun, later he wrote other things, but Calhoun arranged for the Intracoastal Waterway. Midway running eastward comes out on a nothing road that today has become Highway 17, surely the single most godforsaken, dangerous road in South Carolina. It was always dangerous, but there weren't as many people on it. And there was a midway directly across from Midway on the river, and we are in Midway. We're in Midway. Our fire department, you'll notice back there, our priest is chaplain of the fire department, and we've got the bell from the Midway Fire Department, which he rings for acolytes to bring the cross forward. I am the world's oldest acolyte. I used to be the world's biggest, but then Jim Cody came, and he's 6 inches taller and 70 pounds heavier, so now I'm only the world's oldest acolyte. Up and down the Waccamaw River, the neck, which is in between Waccamaw River and the Atlantic Ocean, up and down the Waccamaw River and its first cousin, PD, there were 47 plantations. George Rogers has chronicled them in a book that Bess has, if you want it. There were around 1,000 people. After 1832, most of them were Episcopalian. At this point, I'm it's really local, granular, in some ways, I guess, even trivial. I'm going to do everything backward and different from normal patterns in slavery. Do we have the picture of Watson? This is Watson Brown. Watson Brown gave himself the name Brown on freedom in 1865. He was originally Watson. Things start with him. Actually, his father, Abram, isn't that the perfect name? Abram, probably came from Ghana. That's what the family tradition says. Probably came about 1819. He didn't come like going to the travel agency and buying a ticket. He was captured, thrown on a slave ship, brought 3,000 miles across the Middle Passage, probably into Charleston, as so many came, as we were told, and then was bought. We're not absolutely sure who bought him. That's still a project I'm working at. He was likely owned by Governor Austin, but it's also possible he was owned by Ward, John Jacob Ward. Either way, he was on a plantation with about 1,000 souls who were enslaved. He was permitted to marry, and that marriage was most likely consecrated as a sacrament by Alexander Glennie, an Episcopal priest who moved up and down the Waccamaw River in the PD and was based at All Saints Chapel, and also was based over on Pawleys Island, which you understand is not here, it's over there. And Abram was married officially. This excuses nothing on those plantations, for which there is no excuse, but very few of those families were broken up. Remember, this is local history. Very few of those families were broken up. They were able to stay together, and that's why I'm able to follow the Brown family from Abram down to today, because those families were not broken up. They were Episcopalian. Watson was also able to read and write. That's extraordinarily unusual. In fact, I used to terrify kids at Carolina that if you tried to teach a black man to read and write before 1865, you would be hung till death. And I had an example of people who were hung to death for the sin of teaching people to read and write. If they're going to read and write, you don't want them anywhere near the Bible, because Jesus was not a rice planter. Okay? And Mary did not join the United Daughters of the Confederacy. For all that, Abram was able to read the Bible. And he began to memorize the Book of Common Prayer. A bishop from the Midwest, Philander Chase, came and followed Father Glennie around to the different plantations and also to All Saints. All Saints had maybe 100 people. About 90 of them were black who attended, and those white who attended were the planters. But that was a church built by black hands for mostly a black congregation that had the white owners there too. They memorized the Book of Common Prayer, even the Latin parts, and were very proud of being able to say the Kyrie eleison and the Sursum Corda. They may or may not have had printed versions of the Book of Common Prayer. They mostly memorized it. And some students at Coastal Carolina who were active in theater, I talked to them about how in the world do you memorize for a theater production these long, complicated lines. And they told me, well, it's the rhythm and it's the music. And if you get the rhythm and the music, you've got it. And Abram and his people memorized the rhythm and the music of the Book of Common Prayer. Bishop Chase, as he went around, noticed that everyone recited everything just right. It took 2 hours, and he also noticed that if Father Glennie, who had to go to many places in a given Sunday, if Father Glennie tried to skip a collect or a short shrift, one of the prayers, people would politely interrupt and sing aloud what he was leading out. When this rather long day of going around was over, the Midwestern bishop said, I wish that our white people had a clue what was in the Book of Common Prayer compared to what these enslaved people have. Watson Brown is the son of Abram Brown. He is born in slavery, either to the man who owned 1,000, Governor Austin, or the man who owned 1,000, Mr. Ward. He was baptized by Alexander Glennie and probably by Bishop Davis, who came up here to baptize. He married Louise in a marriage consecrated by Father Glennie. He had 7 children, and those 7 children were all baptized by Father Glennie, and some by Bishop Davis. Watson also could read and write, and had a Bible, and could read it, and studied it, and had access to the Book of Common Prayer, and insisted on it being done correctly. Do we have a picture of the church? Okay. Watson often worshiped here. This becomes the home of the Brown family. And some of the worship came in the Brown home, some came out in the woods. We had young scholars from Carver's Bay here yesterday, and I practiced talking to them much as I'm talking with y'all. And one thing I asked them was, to have a church, do you have to have a building? And to have a church, do you have to have a priest? And here, the answer was, the ecclesia formed where it formed. And you prayed together, and you worshiped together, and you centered on the Word, the Logos, in the Bible. Even if you didn't have a Bible, you centered on it. And you might not have an ordained priest. You might have a licensed lay reader, and that licensed lay reader was from the Brown family, starting with Watson, really starting with Abram, and they would recite things from the Bible. As much as I can tell, they really tended to focus on what we call the Old Testament, the Tanakh, and studied a couple of things there that are hard to miss. You can be up and you can be down, like Frank Sinatra would sing about. You can be in charge of everything and you can be a slave. You can lose a war, you can win a war. You can have hundreds of years of dominance and hundreds of years of being subservient. But there's always God. And God is no less powerful whether you're on top or on bottom. But unlike Frank Sinatra, you may not get to do it your way. You'll do it God's way. God's way. Can we see the tombstone? This is the tombstone for Watson Brown. The tombstone was knocked down during the Hurricane Hazel, which I recall is one of the things that first genuinely terrified me when I was young. And it's hard to blow down a tombstone because they're not sticking up very high and they're stuck in pretty well, but it was blown down. And for some years we didn't have Watson's tombstone. I think somewhere out there across Highway 17, I think Abram is buried in our cemetery. His tombstone is gone too. And one of my goals is to try to find Abram's grave, and even if we can't, to put up some kind of marker for Abram, because it wouldn't be Holy Cross Faith Memorial without Abram. Do we have the tombstone rubbing? We have here a young scholar. It was, by the way, it was almost as lousy as today. It was cold. You know, it's never supposed to be cold here. And when I put away some of my warm coats the other day and profoundly regretted it. You'll see a young scholar, appropriately wrapped up, is doing a rubbing of Watson Brown's tombstone. He may not have been born in 1855. He may have been born in 1849. That's another thing for me to straighten out. One of the things we historians do is we deal in probabilities and possibilities. And we are humbled by how often we have to say, I don't know. I know probably. I know probably he was born in 1849. I know for sure he lived until 1949. I also know that by living 100 years, starting in slavery, coming through Jim Crow, he accomplished something. Because our demographers tell us black families tended to have 13 babies, 7 would be lost. Those who didn't die in infancy did very well to live to be 33. It was not just Jesus who only made it to 33. And as we are reminded often, Jesus was crucified. A lot of black people were crucified too. Our lovely live oaks, we're not sure just which ones, but our lovely live oaks were also sacrificial rituals where black people were hung until dead. We, doing these rubbings we were able to take the current members to bring home something from their past. I took the children out and told them we'd do rubbings that I'd always done, and I instructed them carefully about getting your lead pencil and don't rub too hard. Miss Amanda, who has infinitely more sense than me, the priest wife, she said, no, take this crayon and bear down on the thing as hard as you can. And we got much prettier. Do we have a picture of some of we got much prettier tombstone rubbings? Crayons work better than number 2, lead pencil. Back to our schoolhouse. This is Mr. Ben Martin, and his grandson is here with us today. Mr. Ben Martin was born in Fairfield County. He was educated. He wanted to go to seminary at the colored seminary that was established, now named for Bishop Payne, in Petersburg as part of the Virginia Seminary. There was talk about building some kind of seminary in Charleston, but like a lot of things we do in the Low Country, just talk. Okay. Mr. Ben wanted to go to seminary, but of course they wouldn't take a Negro. There was something else you may notice. He's got a good, strong left arm. You can see it's of size and powerful. But his right arm, it's not there. There was an accident, apparently with a mule, but some kind of accident as a child. He lost his arm. He could not go to the colored seminary because he only had one arm. I asked the kids from Carver's Bay, do you really think your school teacher or your minister needs 2 arms to teach you? And they said they could do okay with a 1-arm teacher. We may remember President Harry Truman once pleaded for a 1-armed economist who would simply say what was going to happen instead of on the one hand, on the other hand. Mr. Ben, with his 1 arm, was unable to be ordained. For all of that, from 1914 to 1924, he really was the priest here. He was the priest. And that was understood. That was understood by his bishops, because bishops, from time to time, do understand things. I wasn't being sarcastic. He taught them in this building, which is right over there. We've got the footprint of the building, and you may want to go out there and look at the footprint of it. We now call that Ms. Ruby's garden. He taught about this number of children, preparing them for high school. He also had everybody come to church there. And I know it strains credulity, but people that I believe much more than others insist that on Sunday they got 100 people into this simple wood frame building. So I think that happened. There was also, this is Annieville. Can we have the picture of Annieville? Annieville's the woods. This is where the Brown family were able to buy land. When General Sherman came here, he brought with him General Saxton, and there was land that the rice planters, these brave heroes of the Confederacy, ran away from as quick as they could get. And some of them died, and they left, they were intestate. They didn't leave any will about who got what land. So General Saxton took the intestate land and sold it off. He did not give it away. He sold it off to former slaves. Watson was able to buy acreage in Annieville. Forget all those White Houses there, they weren't there. He was able to buy land in Annieville. And other people were able to buy land right over there in Parkersville. Parker was a Charleston black man who bought land and then sold it to black people here. Other things happened for Watson that didn't happen for just anybody. General Saxton also established a postal savings bank. You could go to the postal station and put the money you had earned in the bank, and you can make a loan at low interest. This is, of course, radical, and we've heard the word communist. I reckon it is communist, although it involves a certain feature of capitalism. There was a man, Reverend Bruce Williams, who was born on the Richmond Hill plantation on the Waccamaw. His owner was Dr. McGill. We can talk about Sugar House. Dr. McGill, and he's probably got a relative sitting out there, and that's fine. Dr. McGill was the toughest of all the owners. He didn't feed his people enough, and he beat them too hard. And the standard, for beating and feeding, if you were thought to be bad by the other planters, you were pretty bad. However, Dr. McGill arranged for Bruce Williams to learn to read and write. I spent a while talking to the kids from Carver's Bay, 9th graders, that they not quit and that they go to college, learning to read and write. White people didn't want you to do that because it is an avenue to power. Bruce Williams also learned the Bible, like the other people did. He probably had something to do with Father Glennie. When he was free, Bruce Williams went to North Carolina, I'm not sure where, and became an ordained African Methodist Episcopal minister. He came back and he bought land, as you could, from General Saxton, and he bought 20 acres where we're sitting, and eventually gave it to the Diocese of South Carolina for the purpose of building a church and school for Negroes. Negroes was the term used by those people in that time, and I think it's perfectly honorable as he used it, so I used it too. Bruce Williams was elected to the lower house of South Carolina and later was elected to the Senate in South Carolina. Everywhere else, Reconstruction in 1877 was an end, but here it persisted. We had a system called fusion in Georgetown County. Fusion meant, and this is radical, it's probably communist. Fusion meant that white people who worshiped the Confederacy, whose fathers had been corporals in the Confederates and therefore had highway markers, called corporal in the Confederate Army, okay? They would vote for Negroes if the Negroes would vote for white people, if the white people would get along and not kill them. This is fusion. It lasted a long time in Georgetown, longer than anywhere else. Because of that, Bruce Williams was able to serve a long time in the South Carolina General Assembly. At the very end of his time, we get a change in the Constitution brought by Ben Tillman and his people, who were heroes to my people. And that ended even fusion and ended office holding by Negroes and ended voting by Negroes and ended the civil rights that had existed such as to be able to go into a restaurant and eat, and to ride in a boat with white people up and down the Waccamaw River, and to get on the train and pay for first class and ride in first class. These things disappeared. And a Supreme Court, this is not the first Supreme Court to embarrass itself. The Supreme Court in 1896 announced that, of course, segregation is okay. Of course. Has nothing to do with anything Mr. Lincoln said. Segregation is fine. Bishop Howe, who by and large is not a bad guy, Bishop Howe raised money to put a building over here on the land Bruce Williams had given. And I've been so proud of him. But one thing I learned in history is, I'm not perfect. And you don't want to talk to my wife too long about my imperfections. And I'd rather you not know certain things. Well, Bishop Howe wrote a letter to people, rich Yankees in Boston and Providence, to get money to build a building here. And I was so proud of him. Then I read the letter. My friend Charles got me a letter. Bishop Howe's a good man, but like me, has imperfections. In the letter he says, we won't build a building where they will learn to read and write. And then in a moment of stunning Bishop humor, he says, the state of South Carolina is paying for Negroes to study. What we will do is build them a building where they can worship. Well, the state of South Carolina was paying about a dime per student for education. Only paying about $1 per student for white people, but that ratio would continue deep into, really until I was born. It then became apparent to Watson and his people, the Browns, that if they were going to have a school, they would have to do it themselves. They would have to do it themselves. Do we have Isaac? Okay. Isaac Brown, the son, one of the 7 sons of Watson. Isaac Brown, generally known as Big Ike, because he stood close to 6'2" at a time when other people were around 5'4". Big Ike would buy food and dry goods from white people, because we did have Jim Crow, and white people would not sell to black people. He would buy the food and then come sell it or give it away to the black people here. Big Ike had a store, and that store was called the Hominy Store, because hominy grits was the main staple. And he gave away about as much as he sold. And that church for a long time, until we could get a building over here, that church was the church. And before we get Mr. Ben, Big Ike, or his brother, Alan, would recite from the Bible and recite from the prayer book. And as far as I know, they recited. They didn't really have books to use. But they were doing what the segregationists did not want. They were reading the Bible, talking about the Bible, and reciting prayers about black people and freedom and heaven. I don't have a picture of Big Ike. That's another one of these tasks that I'm determined to finish before I'm finished. Mr. Ben did a good job. You have the picture of Mr. Ben again. Mr. Ben did a good job teaching and preaching. And he had important help from the diocese. 3 bishops insisted that Mr. Ben be allowed to come to Charleston to the diocese conferences and to sit with the ministers and with the lay delegates. But the ministers and the lay delegates, the white people, they said, we do not intend to sit with Negroes. And so Mr. Ben never actually attended one of these diocesan conferences, despite the insistence of 3 straight bishops that happened. Bishops don't have real control over every priest in every chapel. Remember I told you All Saints was about 90% black before the war? Immediately after the war, right after it, Father Glennie was told, no Negroes are going to come here. The people he had baptized, they are not to come here to All Saints. And they'd also built a handsome Prince Frederick. Black people, Renty Tucker had built that, and it was black. Black people were told, you're not worshiping here. They were thrown from the very buildings they had built. But they'd already been worshiping in the woods, and they were worshiping in storefronts, so they could do that again. Once black people were thrown out, this is really out in the sticks. I know today people brag about Pawleys Island, and can even be a little snooty about it, but it was way out in the sticks. There weren't many white people here. There weren't that many black people here. So All Saints and the other churches, they were almost empty. They were almost empty. But they were white. There were no Negroes there. Mr. Ben held forth over here. His wife, Viola, do we have the Viola? His wife, Viola, who had learned how to read and write very young and was able to teach. His wife, Viola, had a building over in Parkersville, right through there. And she taught younger children and could do lay leading. Women aren't supposed to be involved in, priestly affairs. But she was, and she did, despite law, and worked with the prayer book. It was you did a mule ride of about an hour to get over there. So you had black kids studying in 2 different places, sometimes called Holy Cross and sometimes called Faith Memorial, sometimes called St. Mary's. I cannot disentangle what each building was called. I cannot even disentangle what the spot in the woods was called. But there were believing Episcopalians worshiping in both places. In I think we have a rubbing of Ms. Viola. She was known locally as Ms. Viola or Ms. Ben. In 1924, Mr. Ben died. He caught pneumonia. Plenty of people catch pneumonia and live, but in 1924, pneumonia was often a death sentence. He died. He left her pregnant with 4 small children and an empty school building and her own school building. The Brown family circled the wagons and helped her run the school and helped her to run the church. We have Erasmus Baskerville. Erasmus Baskerville was born near Washington, D.C. His family was involved in the Grand Army of the Republic, fought for their own freedom. He served in the Spanish-American War, like my namesake grandfather did, and is buried in Arlington. And we have his tombstone from Arlington. He was able to get his divinity degree, I think in 1907. Charles helped get me a book Odell Greenleaf Harris wrote and described everyone who went to what is now the Bishop Payne Library with the white people over in Arlington, but then it was in Petersburg. And we see he was ordained. He did know his Greek and his Latin, because as Canon McCall often reminds me, black people really insisted that their priests be educated. That was very true here. And they would interrupt you if you did your Latin wrong. Okay? So he could do it right. He had some time preaching and teaching in Kentucky. Then he came to Charleston, the Holy City. He made the acquaintance of W.E.B. Du Bois. He was radical. Du Bois is a communist. He wrote Souls of Black Folk, a book that I read and loved. And in there is Alexander Crummell, a black Episcopal priest in Massachusetts, in New York, who was told that he could not sit with the white priest in New York, and he said fine, and never went to the bishops' conferences in New York or Massachusetts. Du Bois, of course, was in mortal combat with Booker T. Washington, and that put him into conflict with South Carolinians, with Edmund Joyner, who was otherwise a wonderful man who helped do industrial education for black people throughout Charleston and the Low Country. But Du Bois said, it is not enough to learn industrial education. You should know philosophy. You should know poetry. You should know history. You should know that you are equal. And Du Bois made the Charleston YMCA a center of radical communist thinking. And I'm not being sarcastic. It just, communist was different in those days. And Du Bois encouraged Baskerville with the education here. And he said, you know, they can't be with white kids, but that's okay. The white kids don't need to know what they're being taught. You can teach them they are equal. You can teach them that God is their God too. Du Bois, remember, is Episcopalian as well as communist. You can teach them Hegelian idealism, a German idealism. You can teach them that. Erasmus Baskerville arranged for baptism, marriage, confirmation, and also arranged, can we have our picture of the Rev? He also arranged for the Rev, William E. Forsythe, with his official Anglican cigar. Marcia and I were looking at that, and the kids from Carver's Bay were looking at it, and they said, I wouldn't want to fool with him. And Marcia said, well, he got tough because of the Ku Klux Klan. And that's true. And he was tough on the kids. He educated. If they messed up the Greek and the Latin, he pounded them with his belt. His wife, Ms. Ruby, pounded them too. And we have these palmetto fronds. If you did something wrong, you were sent out to cut down a palmetto frond, and then that was wielded on you. There was a difficulty. Our building over here burned down. And we were once again out in the woods. But Erasmus Baskerville and the Rev met up with the Huntingtons, who built Brook Green. And the Huntingtons agreed to build the white building that is over there. And John Sands, Jesus' brother, who will be sainted, who hates people to call him out. John Sands, a great man, despite his overdone humility, he has been working longer than you've been living to get that thing on historical register. And it's about to make it. And I hope it makes it before it falls to the ground. Our priest insists that we will spend some money keeping it from falling to the ground. Church moved over there. Church and school moved over there. The Rev and Ms. Ruby lived upstairs and raised child Burns upstairs and taught the children downstairs. They did that from 1937 until 1974, when the Rev died. Ms. Ruby kept on from 1974 until 1992. There are several thousand black people who were educated there with Latin, Greek, palmetto fronds, and leather straps. We did an honoring of Ms. Ruby, and there were any number of women my age, some of whom had come in slacks,
and said she had never permitted them to wear slacks. The reason was when she beat them, she wanted the bare legs. You know, blue jeans can kind of protect you. And that now that she was dead, they occasionally wore slacks, but still felt guilty. In 1992, Ms. Ruby conducted her last class, graduated her last class, and died. This is kind of a long period of service. George Bush, the elder, recognized her with 1,000 points of light during the hurricane. You know, we date things here by hurricanes. During the Hurricane Hugo, there was such suffering here and so many people with nothing to eat. Ms. Ruby and others helped. And this place, which is black, helped rich white people who couldn't get in their homes to eat and get blankets and things. But it was okay because white people had always been kindly to them. Right. That was possibly sarcasm. I've gone on too long, but I want to show you a few more things. The Brown family is still here. This church eventually built a chapel over there. And we only had irregular priests coming in. We had Father Tony Campbell, who ran Camp Baskerville, but he wasn't really the priest. He was in charge of Camp Baskerville. So we did church when we could. It was the Brown family, plus judges and Deeses and Jenkins and others that I'll think of in the fullness of God's time. And they were there. And something happened, embarrassing things happened. Much charity was done here. You'll see as much about food banks and medical clinics as about church. The Hominy Church gave away food and was the main charitable arm on the Waccamaw Neck. I don't know how in the world this happens, but bankers can do what they want to when they want to. Someone loaned a lady a spectacular sum of money mortgaged against this property. And she drove a fine Mercedes and had wonderful clothes. And the church didn't see a nickel of that large sum. We call this embezzlement. The bank calls it a mortgage. You owe the money, even if you never saw a nickel of it. With this crisis, a group of people, including my priest in Greenville, Father Tom Carson, and Manuel Reed, and Father Tommy Tipton, gathered. These men knew business, and they knew how to restructure a loan to pay off that mortgage. And they had a meeting. Can we see the picture? I really should feel guilty about Marsh. We have a picture of two more people in the Brown family. Remember, the Brown family are the church. They're good. Okay. This is Roddy Brown, and Ms. Dot, who married a Bond, but really was still a Brown. And she sat right over here where my wife is sitting. And she persuaded me to come into this church and sponsored me to reaffirm my baptismal vows, even though I was snooty about, we'd been Episcopalian since 1530 in England. But she put her hand on my shoulder, and my baptismal vows were reaffirmed. Here, right over there. Tommy Tipton came and talked to Roddy and to Dot and other people, and he said, All Saints Church is getting ready to throw out anybody who's gay or an ally of a gay or who is willing for the Bishop of New Hampshire, who's gay, to be the bishop. They're going to be looking for a church to come to. They may want to join you. Well, there are already white people here. One thing Roddy always told me was, there were always white people, some in this church. It was always integrated. It was All Saints that was segregated, that wouldn't let black people in. He said, they can come. Roddy also admitted he didn't particularly like the idea of gay. But children of God are children of God, and they could come. Father Tipton told him, you got about 40 people. There's liable to be 200, there's eventually 600 white people coming, and you're going to lose your identity as a black church. They said, we'll always be a black church, it's okay. So they came. As the time went by, the gays were accepted, and indeed, Ms. Dot was told, we have a candidate for associate rector, but he's gay. Can you accept that? She said, well, I want to meet him. I want to meet anybody before I accept him. So she met him, and he passed muster. And from then on, associate priest, gay or otherwise, had to pass muster with Ms. Dot. And Roddy came around to say that, we accept all. We accept all. As we do today. And a vestry gathered, and Bishop Lawrence gave a speech about some people think Jesus loved unconditionally. And then he was sarcastic and said, of course, that's nonsense. And this vestry immediately wrote a new mission statement. Welcoming all because God loves unconditionally. Do you see Roddy? One of my plans that didn't work was to bring out of the congregation Roddy Brown, to bring him off of the screen out to you in person. Roddy usually sits right over there at the 8 o'clock Mass. He is 5th generation Brown, going all the way back to Abram, and is happy to be in this building instead of in the woods or in a schoolhouse. His son, Roderick, 6th generation Brown, is well-trained, professional, and comes here often, and was a student of Ms. Ruby over in that building there. And my plan was to show you live and in person Roddy and Roderick to end things with the 5th and the 6th generation of the Brown family.
Well, everything is looking positive. I mean, it's with the buildings and the expansion we have now. Couldn't have, it was startling to see the growth over the last 40, 50 years. It started in that building, and then we've had the food program, we had the camp, which was in this area here. And those children came during the summer times. There were little cabins, and that's called in Baskerville, I'm sorry. And so that lasted for many years, and we erected so many buildings. Now you've got the food pantry, and we didn't have any of those, but we had an outlet store where we could come and gather food and whether clothing, whatever. And there was a lunchroom over there where that food pantry. Mm-hmm. And there were several smaller buildings, but the diocese, there was always something going on, some meeting. People would come together, and we had the programs here with Ms. Rupert Forsyth and her husband, Reverend W.E. Forsyth, being educators as they were. They always had programs, the Easter programs, and we've had people from the other communities would come here because of the school. They had children here, maybe 200 children. The classes were self-contained and had assistant teachers and whatever. So we had a vibrant community.
Oh yeah, I was talking to my dad earlier about the days back in the chapel or the church, and I remember at one point when I was the young kid, probably between 5 and 8, it's probably 10 of us in the whole church. And we keep that going week in and week out. Even Dad would preach, lay read, from time to time. And, it was rough days, but ultimately, we persevered, I guess, as a group and a community. And, from those days of 10, now we have 300, 400, 500. Miss Ruby, I remember Miss Ruby and my grandmom were really, really tight. I remember the days of the old Easter speech, Easter speech day. That was either the week before Easter or the week after Easter, but it used to be a big shindig where all the kids in the community would come to provide an Easter speech that Miss Ruby herself had hand-selected for each of the kids. And, first of all, she knew all the Easter speeches and who had the Easter speech. And there were so many kids. And then on top of that, for the kids, it was somewhat of a traumatizing experience because, you had 500 people in the church. The church was jam-packed, people outside the church. And you say your Easter speech, and from there, you'd have a happy Easter. So anyway, those are some of the good memories.
These people proved that it doesn't matter how hard it is, you can have church, you can have a school, you can learn to read and write, you can worship. These things can happen, as they still happen. And you can welcome in gay people, you can welcome in black people. We are family, all brothers and sisters. Yeah, Father Will.
Yeah. Yes. I'd like to follow our leadership of our bishop and as our pause. And if we can just take a moment. First off, thank you, Jack, for that blessings to you. Let's take another moment of silence before we transition. Just a quick moment of silence. Amen.